Well, welcome and thank you all for coming. I wanted to also acknowledge that my friends in the audience here, Claire, Steve, Jumane, and my daughter Jean, who actually encouraged me repeatedly to arrange this event, which I'm so glad I did. So I've been visiting with Jean since I've been here in the area, and so I'm so glad I pursued that and listened to my daughter. So that was great. But I'll come back to my main sort of prepared remarks in a moment, but today, of course, is the 50th anniversary of the assassination of President Kennedy, and those of us of a certain age remember this very well. We remember where we were, and I think looking at the audience, I think most of you are in that same category as I'm in, remembered where we were, what we were doing, and there are lessons that Kennedy still can teach us today. I'm sure you've followed all the endless books and documentaries and TV shows and commentary and so on. But one thing from President Kennedy that has a direct relevance to my talk is that he listened and learned as president. Among the examples of this, and having covered the White House for 27 years, I can tell you that many presidents do not listen and learn. They're sort of frozen in their own little bubble, and they don't break out of it. But President Kennedy managed to do this. So he was an American aristocrat, came from a very wealthy family. His dad, Joe Kennedy, financed his political career, and a tremendous advantage that Kennedy had. But when he took office, he expected to be a president dealing with the superpower relationship, the U.S. versus the Soviet Union. His only contact, for instance, with African Americans was with the valet who drew him 2 baths a day and laid out his clothes and shined his shoes. But as time went on, he noticed that this tremendous ferment was going on called the Civil Rights Movement. And by 1963, the year he was killed, he had embraced the Civil Rights Movement. And so that's one example about he did listen and learn. He paid attention to the news media. And one point I always has registered with me and with Kennedy is that he was a hero in World War II in the Pacific, and he admired physical bravery. And by paying attention to what was going on in the country, in the news media, and by the way, presidents for years now have not paid a lot of attention to the news media. That's another topic of a whole other talk. But Kennedy did pay attention. He saw, of course, the protesters being beaten and being arrested, police dogs, fire hoses, and he admired their physical bravery. And that really resonated with him. So you remember, 63 was the year of the March on Washington. He embraced the Civil Rights Movement. And so he listened and learned, and he was actually on the right side of history. A couple of other 2 quick examples from Kennedy that have a direct relevance to the prisoners of the White House notion. He also listened and learned on foreign policy. He had 2 fundamental decisions he had to make, the most dramatic and visible decisions. One was how to deal with the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, shortly after he became president. And the second was how to deal with the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. The difference was night and day. He was a neophyte for the first crisis, and it went very badly. The invasion failed, the U.S. support never materialized, and it was a terrible embarrassment for the country around the world, but Kennedy took responsibility for it. Historians who've studied Kennedy, and in my own research, I found this to be true, that he concluded after that first Bay of Pigs crisis that he was too much in a bubble in the White House because he was listening too much to the so-called experts in the military and the intelligence community. And he realized that these people had their own little bubble that they were in. At that time, our military brass were basically hawks, like Curtis LeMay. You might remember some of these names. Wanted to bomb, and so on. But then he realized that he couldn't pay attention to these folks as much as he had, so he broadened his inner circle. So by the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, in addition to listening to the military brass and the intelligence community, he was following his own judgment. He was skeptical of them because he felt they had led him astray the year before, and he was I think, much more adept at making these decisions. And of course, that Cuban Missile Crisis goes down in history as a success for the United States. That lasts to this day as we look at the Kennedy administration. So just sort of as a moment in history, Given that this is the anniversary of President Kennedy's death, I just wanted to start off with a little Kennedy moment, who I talk in the book about someone who did, as I say, listen and learn, and was able to break out of the isolation of the White House. Now, this notion of the isolation of the White House has been around for a very long time. President Washington in 1789 understood the natural isolation that the president would have, even though he was our first president. He was setting a lot of precedents. But even the title of the presidency indicates the problem we've had from the beginning. What did they want to call our president? They came up with different titles: His Highness, and one title was His High Mightiness. And George Washington said, they sound great, but Mr. President will be just fine. And that's the title he adopted and we've kept to this day. President Harry Truman called the White House the Great White Jail. President Clinton said it was the crown jewel in the federal penitentiary system. And President Obama said that one of the mistakes he made in his first term was failing to break out of the White House and move around the country as much as he should have, and that he's trying to change that now. So we've had this problem, and presidents have recognized it. George Reedy, who was an advisor to Lyndon Johnson 45 years ago, wrote a book called The Twilight of the Presidency, and he said that the biggest problem that he could see coming for the presidency was being isolated from reality. And I think, if anything, it's gotten worse since then because of many of the factors that I'm about to talk about. Some of them are positive things for the president's day-to-day life. A president has these tremendous perks of office. A president is treated like a king in some ways. There's a giant White House staff that's there to do whatever the president wants. There's about 132 household staff members in addition to the official political staff. There's Camp David, the presidential retreat. There's Air Force One. And I wrote a book about Air Force One, and I can tell you that of the 5 presidents I've covered, that's the thing they always say they miss the most when they leave office, the flying White House. And never has to wait. Having been traveling a lot lately, it's a tremendous advantage. Never have to wait in line at an airport, never having your plane delayed. They clear a 2-mile swath in the sky for Air Force One. And so it's a wonderful way to travel, and presidents just love it. But the point I'm making is that it's a very abnormal life. And I remember when I first started covering the White House, and I walked through the Northwest Gate in 1986, and shortly after that, I just realized how really abnormal the president's life is. As I say, some is positive, some is negative. Among the positive parts is all the other perks in the White House: the family theater, the ability to use military golf courses, which President Obama uses a lot and other presidents have used, and the tremendous deference that people give you. But on the other side, the life of the president is very difficult to deal with, to keep in contact, for a number of reasons. One is security. Of course, we talked about the Kennedy assassination, but every time there's a security issue, whether it's attempted assassination, 9/11, the security goes up, and it never goes back to the way it was before. We were talking about this a little earlier, about how the security gets more and more intense. If President Obama was speaking here today, there'd be Secret Service guards all over, one on each side of him, on the podium, in the halls, on the street, motorcade ready to go, plainclothes Secret Service agents in the audience. It's more intense than I've ever seen. I remember interviewing President Obama, and there were literally a Secret Service agent behind the curtain, just standing there. Now, I'm not a very menacing-looking person, am I? But nevertheless, this is what they do, no matter who you are. So you just wonder how a president could have any kind of a normal human interaction with this incredible security that's around everywhere. President Obama and other presidents have tried to break out of the White House, meet with families in their homes and so on. President Jimmy Carter actually stayed overnight in people's homes. But that must be quite difficult, because I've had a security cordon when there was a thought given to have President Clinton to come to my house in the Washington area, and people look in your closets, they look under your bed, they look everywhere. Now, President Clinton didn't end up coming, but I just got a taste of what it's like. President Carter stayed in people's homes, trying to reach out, trying to get a sense of everyday life, but after a while, the big Democratic donors say, well, I'm giving all this money to you, why can't you stay with me? So he stopped staying with everyday people, and he started staying with the donors. Just another example of how difficult it is for a president to stay in touch. The decisions that a president makes also cause this kind of problem. I have